Hello, and welcome to Amplified History, a podcast about the long, strange, occasionally sweaty story of rock and roll. I'm Robert, and over the next 10 episodes, we're going to follow this music from its roots in the American South to packed stadiums, broken guitars, bedroom amplifiers, moral panics, and the point where somebody inevitably says, "You know, the early records were better." This is not a podcast about memorizing a list of famous bands. There will be names and dates, of course, because history does occasionally insist on paperwork. But what I really want to understand is how rock and roll happened. How did gospel, blues, country, rhythm and blues, boogie-woogie, and a dozen local traditions crash into each other and produce a sound that seemed, to many people, completely new? We'll talk about musicians, radio stations, record labels, dance halls, church pews, jukeboxes, highways, migration, technology, race, class, teenagers, and the recurring human urge to turn the volume up one more notch than the adults consider reasonable. I'm starting this series because rock and roll can look deceptively simple from a distance. A loud guitar, a backbeat, a singer with a dangerous haircut. But every 3-minute record contains a whole web of stories. Borrowed ideas, transformed ideas, stolen ideas, brilliant accidents, hard work, bad contracts, late-night radio signals, and people inventing the future while trying to make next month's rent. My hope is that you enjoy the music a little differently after hearing those stories. Maybe you notice an old rhythm hiding inside a famous riff. Maybe you hear a gospel shout inside a rock vocal. Maybe you discover a record made decades ago that still sounds like somebody just kicked open the studio door. And because this is the first episode, we're beginning before rock and roll was widely called rock and roll. Today, we're going back to the roads that led to the explosion of the mid-1950s. We're talking about the blues, gospel, country music, rhythm and blues, electric instruments, independent labels, and a few records that refuse to sit politely inside a single category. To help me do that, I am joined by Ms. Harris, historian, record collector, curator of the Backbeat Basement Archive, and, according to her extremely specific business card, an occasional consultant to the ghosts of musicians who still have complaints about their royalty statements.
Hello, Robert. The ghosts are very polite, but yes, the paperwork remains unresolved.
I knew the music business had a long memory.
Longer than you think. Some of those contracts are haunted.
Well, that feels like an excellent place to begin. Ms. Harris, let me start with the question that always appears first. What was the first rock and roll record?
The honest answer is that there is no single answer, and that is not a dodge. It's the interesting part of the story.
So there wasn't one dramatic afternoon when somebody plugged in a guitar, struck a chord, and a government official stamped a form marked, "Rock and roll begins here."
Sadly, no. Historians have proposed many candidates, and each candidate tells you something about what the person making the choice thinks rock and roll is. Are we looking for a driving backbeat, electric guitar distortion, a strong connection to rhythm and blues, a country influence, a new vocal style, a record that reached a young, mixed audience, a song that sounds like later rock records?
So picking the first record is almost like picking the first raindrop in a thunderstorm.
Exactly. You can identify the storm, you can explain the conditions that produced it, but if you spend all your time arguing about one raindrop, you may miss the lightning.
That metaphor is suspiciously elegant.
I've had coffee.
All right, before we get to the candidates, let's talk about the conditions. Where should we begin?
We need to begin with the fact that rock and roll did not emerge from one musical tradition. It grew from several traditions that had been developing for decades. Blues is central. Gospel is central. Country music is central. So are boogie-woogie piano, jump blues, swing, and rhythm and blues. There are regional variations everywhere. Musicians listened to one another, copied one another, toured together, competed with one another, and adapted sounds to fit different rooms and different audiences.
Which already makes the history messier than the familiar image of one heroic inventor.
Much messier. Also much more human. Music rarely arrives as a finished invention. It develops through conversation.
Let's take the blues first. For listeners who know the word but not the history, what do we need to understand?
The blues emerged from African American musical traditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in the American South. It drew on work songs, spirituals, field hollers, ballads, dance music, and other traditions. There wasn't one exact birthplace or one fixed formula. The blues was a flexible musical language.
People often picture one singer with an acoustic guitar.
That's an important image, but it is not the whole picture. There were solo performers, string bands, pianists, jug bands, vaudeville singers, and larger ensembles. The blues could be rural or urban, intimate or theatrical, funny or devastating. Sometimes all of those things in the same song.
And the lyrics could be very direct.
Yes, blues songs often deal with work, money, desire, travel, bad luck, good times, heartbreak, and the frustrating behavior of other human beings, which, fortunately for musicians, remains an inexhaustible subject.
Civilization advances, but someone still leaves without saying goodbye.
Precisely. And musically, the blues gave later rock musicians essential tools. Repeating chord patterns, expressive guitar phrasing, bent notes, call and response, rhythmic drive, and the idea that a singer could sound conversational, rough-edged, and emotionally immediate.
One of the names that appears in almost every history is Robert Johnson.
Robert Johnson is a fascinating figure, although he became even more famous after his death than during his short life. He recorded only a small body of work in the 1930s, but later musicians heard enormous possibilities in those recordings. His guitar playing could suggest several moving parts at once, and his songs entered the repertoire of blues and rock musicians for generations.
We should mention the legend, because this is where the supernatural paperwork department gets involved.
Yes, the story says Johnson met the devil at a crossroads and traded his soul for musical ability. It's a powerful myth, but it has often overshadowed the more realistic explanation. He practiced, learned from other musicians, traveled, performed, and developed his craft.
Less cinematic, but probably more useful for aspiring guitarists.
Very much so. Do not wait at a rural intersection for technical support.
Write that down, listeners.
The Crossroads legend also reveals something important. People sometimes talk about musical talent as magic because they do not see the years of work behind it. Johnson's recordings sound mysterious, partly because they are expressive and technically remarkable. But he was part of a living blues culture, not a solitary wizard appearing from nowhere.
And the blues itself changes as people move.
Absolutely. During the Great Migration, millions of African Americans left the South for cities in the North and West. They brought musical traditions with them. In cities such as Chicago, blues musicians increasingly used amplified instruments to be heard in crowded clubs. Electric guitar, harmonica through a microphone, drums, bass, the sound became louder and more forceful.
So the amplifier wasn't just a toy, it changed what the music could do.
It changed the physical experience. A guitar could cut through a noisy room. A small band could sound huge. Distortion, sometimes accidental and sometimes encouraged, added intensity. Later rock guitarists would build entire careers from sounds that earlier engineers might have considered technical problems.
Rock history, a proud tradition of refusing to repair the equipment.
That is not entirely inaccurate.
Blues is one major road, gospel is another. What does gospel contribute to the sound of rock and roll?
Energy, drama, vocal power, call and response, the emotional build of a performance. In many Black churches, music was participatory. A singer was not simply delivering a polished recital. The congregation responded. The performance could rise in intensity. Voices could shout, plead, soar, and break.
That sounds very close to the way we later describe great rock singers.
Exactly. Many early rock and roll performers learned in church. The sacred and secular worlds were distinct, but musicians carried techniques between them. You can hear gospel phrasing and gospel energy in the voices of artists who later became associated with rhythm and blues, soul, and rock and roll.
And then there is Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
There is always Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
I can hear the capital letters.
Good. They are necessary. Sister Rosetta Tharpe sang gospel music and played electric guitar with confidence, rhythmic attack, and stage presence. She began recording in the 1930s. Her 1944 recording of Strange Things Happening Every Day is often discussed as a major early step toward rock and roll.
What makes that record feel important?
It has a strong rhythmic pulse, gospel vocals, and a sense of propulsion that points forward. But beyond any one recording, Tharpe matters because she complicates the simplified story people sometimes tell about rock guitar. When people picture the invention of rock and roll, they often imagine a young man with an electric guitar in the 1950s. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was already performing with an electric guitar years earlier, and she was doing it with style.
She also performed in ways that feel visually familiar to later rock audiences.
Yes, she played with showmanship. She could make the guitar feel like both a rhythmic engine and a featured voice. She performed gospel, but her influence crossed boundaries. Later musicians noticed.
There is something almost unfairly modern about watching footage of her.
Absolutely. Whenever someone says, this artist was ahead of their time, I usually want to ask whether our understanding of the timeline is the real problem. Tharpe was not borrowing from the future was borrowing from her.
That's good.
Coffee again.
Haha, we may need to credit the coffee as a third guest. Now, some listeners may associate the roots of rock, mostly with blues and rhythm and blues. Where does country music enter the picture?
Country music is essential. In the first half of the 20th century, there were many styles circulating under labels that changed over time. Old-time music, western swing, honky-tonk, bluegrass, hillbilly music. Those industry labels were often crude, but the music itself was diverse.
And country musicians were listening to black musicians.
Yes, and musical exchange went in multiple directions. The South was segregated, and the music business often marketed records along racial lines, but sounds traveled. Musicians heard one another at performances, through radio, on records, in local communities, and on the road.
So the categories in the record shop did not fully describe what people actually heard.
Exactly. Industry categories are useful evidence, but they can also hide connections. A musician could grow up hearing church music, blues, country, pop standards, dance bands, and radio broadcasts from far away. Rock and roll emerges from that overlap.
Where does boogie enter the story?
Boogie-woogie began as a piano-based blues style with a rolling, repeated bass pattern and a strong dance rhythm. It became hugely influential. Musicians adapted the boogie feel to different instruments and settings. By the 1940s, you can hear country musicians recording hillbilly boogie songs that combine country instrumentation with a rhythmic drive that points toward rockabilly and rock and roll.
So before the word rockabilly becomes common, some of the ingredients are already sitting on the kitchen counter.
Yes, the kitchen is crowded. Someone has brought a piano. Someone else has brought an amplifier. Nobody has checked whether the building has sufficient electrical wiring.
Haha, that may be the most historically accurate image of early rock and roll we've had so far. Let's talk about rhythm and blues. What did that term mean around the late 1940s and early 1950s?
It was an industry category used for music marketed primarily to Black audiences. In 1949, Billboard began using the term rhythm and blues for a chart category that had previously been called race records. The new label was less offensive, but it was still a marketing category covering a wide range of music.
Including jump blues.
Yes, jump blues was energetic, dance-oriented music, often featuring horns, piano, drums, and a lively vocalist. It drew from swing and blues, but smaller bands could create a punchy, party-ready sound. Think of a room full of dancers and a band determined not to let anyone sit down.
A noble public service.
Very noble. Louis Jordan is one of the central figures. His records were witty, rhythmic, accessible, and enormously popular. He had a gift for making songs feel like miniature stories.
Jordan's music sometimes sounds like it already understands something important about rock and roll. The song should move, the words should be memorable, and nobody should be forced to wait through a 20-minute introduction before dancing.
Exactly. The emphasis is on rhythm, personality, and connection with the audience. And then we have a song such as Good Rockin' Tonight, written by Roy Brown and recorded by him in 1947. Wynonie Harris recorded a successful version in 1948.
Our Ms. Harris is not related to Wynonie Harris, correct?
Not biologically. Spiritually, I support the principle of good rockin' tonight.
Excellent. What is significant about that phrase, rocking?
The words rock and rocking existed in music long before the 1950s. They appeared in gospel, blues, and rhythm and blues, sometimes referring to spiritual movement, sometimes dancing, sometimes sex, sometimes a general atmosphere of excitement. The language was already available. What changed in the early 1950s was the way the term rock and roll became attached to a broader, youth-oriented musical phenomenon.
Which brings us eventually to radio.
It does, but before we get there, we need one more ingredient, the record business changing under everyone's feet.
What was happening in the music industry after the Second World War?
A number of independent record labels became important, especially in rhythm and blues. Recording technology became more accessible. Magnetic tape changed studio practice. The 45 RPM single became a major format. Jukeboxes helped individual songs travel through bars, diners, and other public spaces.
So a young listener might encounter a song without buying an album or even knowing much about the artist.
Exactly. The single mattered. Radio mattered. Jukeboxes mattered. Local scenes mattered. A song could develop momentum because people danced to it, requested it, and played it again and again.
And independent labels could react quickly.
Yes, a smaller label might record a local artist, press a single, and send it into a regional market. These businesses varied enormously. Some helped artists find audiences. Some used contracts that were, let's call them, creatively unfriendly.
Haunted paperwork again.
Haunted paperwork again.
We also have the story of Sam Phillips and Sun Records in Memphis, although that becomes even more central in our next episode.
Right. Phillips recorded blues musicians and later country-influenced performers. Memphis was an important crossroads city. The larger point is that studios, labels, and radio stations created spaces where sounds could meet. They did not erase segregation or inequality, but they could expose listeners to music that the mainstream industry had underestimated.
This feels important. Rock and roll is not only a style, it is also a story about distribution.
Completely. A brilliant performance that no one hears does not become a cultural explosion. You need records, broadcasts, live shows, jukeboxes, and audiences ready to respond.
And teenagers.
Especially teenagers. In the post-war period, teenagers became increasingly visible as a distinct consumer group. They had tastes, spending money, and a desire for music that felt like their own. Adults have historically found that combination alarming.
A young person enjoying a loud song without written permission.
Terrifying.
Let's return to the question of first records. One song that appears constantly in these discussions is Rocket 88, recorded in 1951 and credited to Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats.
Yes, the band was connected to Ike Turner's Kings of Rhythm, and the recording was made in Memphis. Rocket 88 is one of the most frequently named candidates for the first rock and roll record.
Why?
It has a driving rhythm, youthful energy, a saxophone break, lyrics celebrating a car, and a distorted guitar sound. The song feels forward-moving in every possible sense. It is about motion, style, freedom, and technology.
The distortion has its own origin story.
The famous story is that an amplifier was damaged during the journey to the recording session, possibly after falling from a car. The damaged speaker produced a fuzzy sound. Instead of canceling the session, they worked with it.
The eternal studio philosophy. That is definitely broken. Record it.
Exactly. Now, details around legendary stories can become polished over time, so we should be careful. But the distorted sound is there on the record, and it points toward the creative use of distortion in later rock music.
This is one of my favorite recurring themes in music history. A supposed flaw becomes a feature.
Musicians are resourceful. They use the tools they have, including the damage tools. A clean technical standard is not always the same thing as an exciting record.
Would you call Rocket 88 the first rock and roll record?
I would call it one of the strongest candidates and one of the records everyone should hear. But declaring a winner can simplify the story too much. Earlier records contain important elements. Later records bring the style into focus for wider audiences. Rocket 88 is a landmark, not a starting gun fired in an empty stadium.
That distinction makes sense. The musicians were not waiting for historians to assign them a genre.
Exactly. They were making records.
Another essential record from this period is Big Mama Thornton's original recording of Hound Dog, released in 1952.
Yes, Thornton's performance is commanding. The song was written by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, who were young songwriters at the time. Her version became a major rhythm and blues hit.
Many listeners will know the later Elvis Presley version.
And Elvis's version is important in its own context. But it is crucial to understand that Hound Dog had a history before Elvis recorded it. Thornton's recording is not a footnote. It is a powerful record in its own right.
What should listeners notice when they compare versions?
The performances have different personalities and different arrangements. Thornton's version has authority, humor, and a cutting edge. It is a rebuke delivered with complete control. The later Elvis version has a different tempo, a different attack, and a different cultural moment around it.
This brings us into a difficult part of rock history: how credit, money, and public memory are distributed.
Yes, rock and roll drew deeply from Black musical traditions, and Black artists often faced barriers that white artists did not. Segregated markets, unequal promotion, limited access to mainstream media, exploitative contracts, and racial prejudice affected whose records reached which audiences and who became a household name.
And when a white performer had a hit with a song associated with a Black artist, the story could become flattened into the white performer invented the sound.
Right. The reality is more complicated. We should not erase the talent of later performers, but we also cannot tell the story honestly if we erase the artists, communities, and traditions that made the music possible.
So the goal is not to swap one oversimplified myth for another.
Exactly. The goal is to listen carefully, trace the connections, and remember that innovation often happens in networks. Some artists received enormous fame. Others shaped the sound without receiving equal recognition.
And the contracts.
The Ghost would like the contracts mentioned again.
Duly noted. We have music, records, labels, jukeboxes, and young audiences. How does radio help turn these ingredients into a movement?
Radio could bring rhythm and blues records to listeners outside the markets the industry had originally imagined. Disc jockeys mattered because they selected records, created excitement, and gave audiences a language for what they were hearing.
Alan Freed is one of the names that appears prominently here.
Yes, Freed was a disc jockey who became famous in the early 1950s while broadcasting from Cleveland. He used the phrase rock and roll and promoted rhythm and blues records to a broader audience, including white teenagers. He later moved to New York and became a major figure in popularizing the music.
Did he invent the term?
No. As we discussed earlier, rocking and related phrases existed in songs long before Freed, but he helped popularize rock and roll as a label for this emerging sound and scene.
Which is a different kind of influence.
Very important influence. Names matter. Once a sound has a name, people can talk about it, market it, fear it, organize concerts around it, and complain about it in newspaper columns.
Haha. A genre is not fully alive until someone publishes an editorial warning that it will destroy civilization.
That is the traditional certification process.
Freed also organized concerts.
Yes, one famous early event was the Moondog Coronation Ball in Cleveland in 1952. It attracted far more people than the venue could hold, and the event was shut down. The chaos itself demonstrated the size of the audience and the intensity of the interest.
That sounds like rock and roll discovering, very quickly, that fire codes exist.
Pretty much, the demand was real. Young listeners were excited by the music, and some adults were unsettled by the racial mixing, the dancing, the sexuality, and the challenge to establish cultural boundaries.
The fear was not simply about volume.
No, moral panic often hides other anxieties. Rock and roll was connected to youth culture, black music, changing social behavior, and integrated audiences. That made it feel threatening to people invested in the existing order.
We have mentioned the backbeat several times. Can we slow down and explain it?
In simple terms, many rock and roll songs emphasize the second and fourth beats in a four-beat measure. You can count 1, 2, 3, 4. The snare drum often hits those emphasized beats.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Exactly. That emphasis is not unique to rock and roll, but it becomes central to the feel. It gives the music a physical pull. It invites movement.
It sounds obvious once you hear it, but it changes the body immediately.
That's why listening matters. We can talk about social history and industry history, but rock and roll is dance music. It is felt, not only analyzed.
Historians everywhere are putting down their pencils and attempting to dance.
Some should keep the pencils.
Fair.
The backbeat is part of the larger emphasis on rhythm. In a great early rock and roll record, the instruments feel interconnected. Drums, bass, piano, guitar, horns, hand claps, whatever the arrangement includes, they create momentum.
So even when the guitar becomes iconic later, it isn't the entire story.
Not even close. The guitar matters, but so do piano players, saxophone players, drummers, bassists, singers, backing vocalists, producers, engineers, and the people clapping at exactly the right moment.
The unsung heroes of history, people with excellent timing and functioning palms.
Put that on a plaque.
Let's give listeners a short playlist, not a definitive list, not a ranking, just 5 records that help us hear some of the roads leading toward rock and roll.
Perfect. And the first is Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues, recorded in 1936.
What should listeners notice?
Listen to the guitar movement and the vocal urgency. It is a blues recording, not a rock and roll record. But later rock musicians returned to Johnson's songs because the emotional force and guitar language remained compelling.
Second, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Strange Things Happening Every Day, recorded in 1944.
Listen for the rhythmic energy and the way gospel performance can point toward the future of popular music. Also, remember that a woman with an electric guitar was helping define the possibilities long before the standard rock history poster was printed.
Third, Wynonie Harris, Good Rockin' Tonight, from 1948.
Listen to the invitation in the performance. This is social music. It wants a room full of people. The word rocking is already right there, doing a great deal of work.
Fourth, Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, Rocket 88, from 1951.
Listen to the drive, the distorted guitar texture, and the sense of movement. Even the subject, a car, fits the emerging mythology of youth, speed, and freedom.
Fifth, Big Mama Thornton, Hound Dog, released in 1952.
Listen to the authority in her voice. She owns every second of that recording. And then, later, compare it with other versions. Covers can reveal how songs change as they move between performers and audiences.
5 songs, roughly 16 years, and already we can hear a whole landscape changing.
Yes, and these are only 5 doors into a very large building.
A building with a basement archive.
And ghosts.
Naturally. Let's stand at the edge of the next episode. Imagine it is 1954. What is in place?
Rhythm and blues records have passionate audiences. Country musicians are adapting blues rhythms and boogie patterns. Gospel techniques are shaping singers with extraordinary power. Electric instruments and recording technology are changing the sound. Independent labels are moving quickly. Radio is reaching young listeners. The term rock and roll is gaining visibility.
So the fuse is already burning.
Absolutely. Then, in the mid-1950s, a series of artists and records pushed the music into a much larger public spotlight. Bill Haley and his Comets, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Bo Diddley, Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, and many others.
That is quite a queue forming outside the studio.
It is about to get crowded.
Next time, we'll talk about that breakthrough era. We'll look at the mid-1950s explosion, the rise of rockabilly, the importance of Chuck Berry's songwriting and guitar style, the force of Little Richard's performances, the complicated story of Elvis Presley, and the moment when rock and roll became impossible for the wider culture to ignore.
Also, Robert, you should prepare yourself emotionally for the hair.
The hair?
The hair becomes historically significant.
I had hoped to avoid fashion analysis until at least episode 4.
No, the pompadour waits for no historian.
Fair enough. Before we go, I want to return to the question we started with. What was the first rock and roll record?
And my answer remains, listen to the candidates, enjoy the argument, but do not let the argument shrink the history. Rock and roll was not created in a vacuum. It emerged from decades of musical exchange, creativity, movement, struggle, performance, and experimentation.
It had many parents, many neighborhoods, and more than one front door.
Exactly. And when the sound arrived in the mainstream, it carried all of that history with it, even when the mainstream forgot to mention where it came from.
Ms. Harris, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for allowing me to mention haunted royalty statements more than once.
It would have been irresponsible not to.
They know where you live.
Excellent, wonderful, very reassuring.
Ha ha!
And thank you for listening to the first episode of Amplified History. Next time, the mid-1950s, the breakthrough records, the rise of rockabilly, and the hair that changed America. Until then, find one song from today's episode, turn it up just a little louder than necessary, and listen for the roads that brought it here.